Now, rising inflation is a global phenomenon, and the pinch of the inflationary surge hasn't been felt by people only in the emerging markets and the developing world, but even by those who live in the so-called high-income nations. And even they are feeling the squeeze. Inflation is dominating the headlines in every corner of the globe, from the Americas to Europe to Asia and in Africa. The price of essential commodities has shot up over the course of the last several weeks and months, and the increasing cost is causing people to hit the streets in protest in several nations. Now, the way the central banks are trying to bring down the inflation is to try and increase the key interest rates. But the economic outlook for the global economy as such now looks very grim. And these are the inflation figures for the month of August from around the world. In the month of April, the International Monetary Fund had predicted that the average global inflation level this year will be about 7.4%. And recently, the chief of the IMF has also made a very sobering speech explaining as to why all of this is happening.
First, COVID, then Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and climate disasters on all continents. These shocks have caused immense harm on people's lives. Their combined impact is driving a global surge in prices, especially on food and energy, causing a cost of living crisis.
Now, the last week has seen the OPEC Plus agree to cut oil production, which will add a greater burden to people by raising the cost of fuel. The US stock markets have fallen on Friday due to better than expected job data, and this is because the investors expect the US Federal Reserve to increase interest rates yet again in the wake of the jobs report. And it isn't just the Fed. The different central banks around the world, from the Bank of England to the Reserve Bank in India, everyone is hiking rates to try and tame inflation. The logic, of course, is if you were to suck up money from the market, then that, of course, will bring inflation down by driving demand down. But this, of course, is a gradual solution, but people are extremely worried about how they'll maintain their way of life. They've been hitting the streets in several parts of the world. The British Prime Minister Liz Truss has seen record low approval ratings because of her poor handling of the economy. On Saturday, this is what was, of course, witnessed in Berlin, where people came out on streets against inflation and against price rise and against government inaction. Thousands took to the streets of Prague as well on Saturday. They protested against the galloping inflation that has made it impossible for them to purchase even essential commodities.
In the history of the Czech Republic, since 1993, we have the record inflation. And we can see it in the shops, buying the food and everything. But also, we can see it today in the energy. That today we receive bills for the energy, which are not just double or triple more than before, but it's much more. And it affects a lot of people, the majority of the people.
Meanwhile, in France, oil refinery workers have gone on strike. They are demanding high wages to fight the rise in the cost of essential commodities. The strike caused fuel shortages around the country. Long lines were witnessed at petrol pumps across Paris on Saturday as people were queuing up for several hours to try and get their vehicles filled. Now, inflation is expected to rise further. Economic growth isn't expected to keep pace, and the IMF has also slashed the global growth forecast for next year from 3.2% to about 2.9%. If growth rates stay below inflation, then that means, in real terms, the world grows poorer. The sum of money that could buy you a meal today may not suffice to buy you a meal tomorrow. This is what people are now fighting against. And the IMF chief has painted a very bleak picture of how people will struggle to put food on the table.
Overall, we expect global output as a result of all this to shrink between now and 2026 by $4 trillion. To give you a sense what is $4 trillion, this is the size of the German economy. Gone. And unfortunately, I am the natural optimist, but today I stand in front of you and I need to say, more likely to get worse than to get better.
And also to give us more insights in terms of how this inflation is likely to get worse over the coming weeks, we are being joined by Professor Guido Cozzi, who's a professor of macroeconomics at the University of St. Gallen in New Zealand. Professor, thank you very much indeed for taking time out and speaking to us here in WION. Now, this is a question that is on top of everyone's mind. It was being said that the inflation at this point of time that is being witnessed globally is being driven by the Russia-Ukraine war, which has threatened to push the world economy into a recession and will also, with further escalations expected to take place in the battlefield. Do you expect inflation to rise further substantially in the coming winter?
I don't think inflation will rise more than what it has written already, because it is through all these supply shocks, negative supply shocks that we had, contributed to the shortages of essential inputs and essential consumption goods. But at the same time, the fuel that gives force to inflation is the supply of money that had increased a lot in the past 2 years following COVID. And at the moment, central banks are determined to rein in this supply of money. So behind these mild increases of the interest rate, there is a restrictive monetary policy that should take fuel away from inflationary pressures.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting that you point out that the central banks are trying to bring down inflation by using certain instruments that they have at their disposal. But I want you to weigh in a bit about the inflation that has been caused because of uncertainty in energy supplies. For instance, in Britain, some people may be forced to make some very hard decisions this winter, where either they pay their electricity and gas bills or they have enough to eat. And this is something that has been impacted directly because of the Russia-Ukraine war. Do you expect the situation, especially because of the energy-driven inflation, to get worse in the coming weeks and months?
So inflation is a monetary phenomenon, but recession isn't. So we have a problem of shortages of inputs that are extremely important, like fuel and commodities. And now if inflation is tamed, this means that someone has to pay this. So it becomes a redistributional problem. And governments should take a careful look at the conditions of the poorer segments of society and possibly tax those who gained from the whole process and redistribute to those that suffer the most.
And also the recent decision that has been taken by the OPEC Plus to slash output by about 2 million barrels per day ahead of the winter months. Do you think the price of oil is likely to go much higher from what it is at this point of time?
Well, I view this decision as a fear of there being too much supply of oil. So this gives a message of optimism. If they decided to join efforts to reduce the supply of oil, it means they are scared that the demand may not absorb all and that prices can go down.
And my last question to you is, do you expect the central banks, the Federal Reserve in the United States and other central banks around the world, to further hike interest rates from here?
Necessarily so, because at the moment the interest rates are rising very, very slowly. And if we compare them with the inflation rates, we see that the difference is actually negative. So the real rates are negative. Obviously, this is also due to the need not to overburden indebted governments. However, in the long run, they should increase if they, unless inflation comes back spontaneously, which I don't really believe.
Absolutely, indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Kotzi, for joining us and getting us all those insights there.
You're welcome.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.